Hi, and welcome to Ethics for Addiction Professionals. My name is Desiree Cochran Norfolk. I am a certified master addiction counselor and I have a CAC2 from the Georgia Addiction Counselors Association. I'm also a certified anger management specialist. I have a master's in addiction counseling from Liberty University. In this lesson, we are going to talk about a few things. So, one, I want you guys to really learn about addiction counseling as a new profession. We're going to talk about some of the unique considerations of the chemical dependency field, some of the credentialing, the levels of experience, some discrimination, the consequences of counselors who relapse, and the consequences of counselors who drink or use other drugs, as well as some other things that we're going to learn. But these are the main things that I want you guys to really pay attention to in this. So, there are 5 ethical standards and principles that we should follow as counselors. Not acting in accordance with these standards can really result in a loss of somebody's license and their livelihood, and it could possibly lead to some criminal charges. So let's talk about the principle of non-malfeasance. This really dictates that counselors avoid engaging in acts that could potentially cause harm. And this is both intentionally and unintentionally. So, for example, school counselors obtain and have access to information that could cause harm to a student when questions of confidentiality arise. So, this principle of beneficence suggests that practitioners engage in behaviors and actions that really just promote the best interest of others. It implies that there's a moral obligation to assist those individuals who are most in need of support. And in addition, it's going to emphasize the responsibility that school counselors hold in maintaining competency within their field. And that's just any counselor. Fidelity, this is an essential requisite to achieving a successful counseling relationship. So this principle suggests that counselors uphold trust in maintaining loyalty and honesty with their clients. So, for example, it might behoove a counselor to fully explain and adhere to the limits of confidentiality while respecting, if it's a child, respecting the parent or guardian's concerns, or also just respecting our client's concerns and their rights and their needs. So the principle of justice is going to refer to treating others equally and fairly. So, in doing so, counselors should not engage in any practices that are discriminatory or that inadvertently promote the well being of one individual over another individual or a group over an individual, but rather, as leaders, they hold the responsibility to advocate for change when they encounter inequitable practices. So, let's talk about this. What is a professional? So the dictionary is going to define a profession as a group of people who share a common body of knowledge, a code of ethics, and also a concern for their peers. So if ethics are essential to being a professional, what are ethics? So again, the dictionary says that ethics comprise the principles of morality. This includes both the science of the good and the nature of the right. And that they constitute the rules of conduct in respect to a particular class of human actions, like medical ethics. So, in healthcare and law and social work, and also among the clergy, the primary purpose of a code of ethics is to guide those professionals in helping the clients and their families while also behaving in a fair and decent way to their colleagues. And it's going to be important to abide by the ancient dictum primum non nocere, or first of all, do no harm. Yeah, it's also going to be important to acknowledge that one can harm not only by acting, but also by failing to act. So, whether or not a given behavior is legal or illegal, it doesn't determine whether or not it's ethical. There are good laws and there are bad laws, and sometimes the court are able to render justice, and other times they can't. So, for instance, physicians attempting to protect themselves from malpractice suits, they might sometimes perform unnecessary procedures. Addiction professionals might feel torn between the need to protect themselves or the institution from litigation, and also the desire to spare the patient from unneeded discomfort or any unneeded expenses. And ethics is not a religion. It's not statistics on what most people do. And it's not a trade union agreement to stop treatment providers from stealing patients from one another. Ethics is the science of right moral conduct, and it's derived from an analysis of human nature by the light of reason. Professionals are expected by the general public and by members of other professions to have high standards and to be responsible for their own colleagues and to act with integrity. So, a simple definition of ethics might be the habit of moral courage. If workers resent being called paraprofessionals, and if they're serious about being truly professional, then they must build a tradition of acting as professionals in their own right. So in athletics, the major difference between the amateur and the professional is that the latter is paid. In social and health services, while a very few professionals are more interested in money than in helping people, the major difference between a business and a profession is that the business is frankly and primarily aimed at making money, whereas a profession is primarily aimed at rendering service. The true professional does not work for a boss or for dollars, but for the purpose of serving the patient. A professional has a genuine concern that disadvantaged people also receive services. Success is not going to be measured in profit, but in quality of service. And some of the noblest professions are the least lucrative. The payoff is measured in personal satisfaction and in the joy, the awe, and the privilege of sharing human lives and also their secrets. So, William White, in his book Recovery Rising, describes the evolution of the addiction counseling field. And he said, each of us brings a personal palette to our work with others. In particular, he brought experiences from a large service-oriented family, experiences growing up in a small rural Illinois community, an early Protestant religious orientation that evolved through the civil rights movement into a sustained and more secularly oriented social activism, and his privileged status and socialization as a white heterosexual American male. There was no particular sense of ethnic identity or heritage, that youthful energy and immaturity, the working class and the union-centered social sensitivities, the marginal survival to exceptional success in his pre-college school years, and a precocious involvement in the world of work since his early teens. And such influences, which are unique for each of us, are as invisible as the air that we breathe, but they exert profound influences on how we perceive and think and feel and act, as well as how we perceive and relate to those who seek our guidance. So, the first tasks of clinicians and recovery support specialists are really just to identify what our own unique influences are and increase our conscious awareness of how these factors enter the helping process, either for the good or the bad. According to White, initially when the field started, most of the counselors were not professionally trained and they relied more on their background with addiction and recovery to guide their counseling. But as the years progressed and certification bodies began to institute guidelines for practice, we start to see a shift. So now we see that there's more professionally trained counselors who have very little personal experience with addiction. Initially, we saw more of a state-centered treatment model. Those who were sent to treatment were sent to those that had little to no oversight. These were large state-run centers, and these centers became almost a closed city of the insane. And they were birthed with the noblest of intentions, and the vision was to remove the mentally ill from their successful or their stressful living environments and the jails and the almshouses to which their care had been delegated previously, or they had been dumped there, and provide them with this quiet sanctuary within which, with the proper care, they could be returned to that wholesomeness and live in the community. But how had such a noble experiment mutated into something so ghastly? How could these people who worked within such an institution no longer see it for its true self? It was as if day by day the deformed nature of these places had become invisible. The very slow transformation into the normal. An institution that was designed as an instrument of rehabilitation had become one through which people were regressed to the subhuman. A culture of care had mutated into a culture of custodial control, even more so than prisons and hospitals. So, what practices of today in the world of addiction treatment do you feel could be judged harshly by historians of the future? What practice in your immediate work environment elicit the most gut level discomfort within you? Is it time that you tried to express your feelings about those practices? How and to who could this best be communicated? So what I want you to do is I want you to take these questions that I've asked here and answer them in the chat for this lesson. You can find the chat underneath the lesson. So to dismantle this aging network of state psychiatric hospitals, the state of Illinois built a network of zone centers in the 1960s. And these centers served multiple purposes. They offered treatment designed to transition people from state hospitals into the community. And they provided that emergency care and that stabilization to keep people out of the state hospital system. And they served as kind of like a base of operation for a lot of different professionals whose job it was to help build these mental health services in the communities across the state. The vision here was that the zone centers would serve as a temporary transition on the way to treating the mentally ill or the developmentally disabled and also the alcohol and drug dependent within those local communities. And if it was successful, it was theorized that the zone centers would work themselves out of existence. The zone center's vision and the realities of what unfolded tell a really important story for the uninitiated service worker. It's a story about how a vision can be partially fulfilled at the same time the forces that shape the design and fate of institutions can change. The zone centers in Illinois did make a significant achievement. They transitioned thousands of patients from the state hospitals to the community, and that laid the groundwork for the closure of many of the state hospitals. They kind of provided that safety net that kept many individuals out of the state hospital system. And they also supported the community organizers who were building the community mental health services across the state. But then there's another side to this story. The patients left the state hospital, but much of the money to support their care remained with the institutions and did not transition to community supports. What started out as a focus on the needs of the mentally ill and their families rapidly shifted to the needs of those linked to the institutional interests of the state hospitals. The dollars that should have shifted from the state hospitals to the community-based services were slowed by the influence of labor unions and cities and businesses that were dependent upon the dollars generated by the state hospitals, as well as a host of politicians that were responsive to their constituencies. While a growing number of people were discharged from the state hospitals, ended up in the local communities where the services were needed, a large portion of the dollars that could have supported those individuals remained with the state hospital. So we can learn a very valuable lesson here about the factors that shape the design and the operation of our service systems. The principle is that service systems set up to meet the needs of service recipients often lose that responsiveness to those needs over time. What this means is that we must constantly struggle to keep personal and institutional needs in the background and the needs of the clients and the families in the foreground. When clients and families' needs are first, such systems are renewed and dismantled. Our greatest conflicts in this field will be from battling and conflicting interests and the needs of the institutions and the clients and the families. So to serve in this arena, you really must be prepared to wage these battles and to recognize when your own interests are getting in the way of serving clients and families. Remaining faithful to that responsibility is going to be a very significant challenge. And workers in the field of alcoholism and other drug dependencies, they have much in common with the other helping professions, particularly those in healthcare. There are, in addition, some unique considerations where one simply can't borrow from the experience of others. And there are differences and they require discussion. One unique difference is going to stem from the fact that many workers in this field have themselves recovered from the same illness from which they're helping others to recover. For many years, alcohol and other drug dependencies were regarded not as legitimate illnesses, but kind of as signs of weaknesses or moral problems. So those afflicted by addiction were labeled as suffering from some sort of character disorder. Having experienced chemical dependency does not guarantee immunity to any other illness, mental or physical, and no single personality type is either fated to develop a problem or sure to avoid it. Some chemically dependent people suffer from character disorders, but the vast majority do not. As a matter of fact, most suffer from an exquisitively well-developed sense of guilt. So the 12 steps of AA, or Alcoholics Anonymous, they provide for a moral inventory, a discussion of character defects within someone else, an attempt at restitution, and an ongoing effort at self-monitoring. But why? Because when one can neither approve of one's own actions nor rationalize them away, there's usually a nagging sense of some sort of inner discomfort. An alcoholic or an other drug addict knows all too well how to make these unpleasant feelings subside, at least for the time being. It's comfortable for them, it's familiar to them. And if negative feelings last too long or they grow too strong, that temptation to reach for the drink or another drug might be too great for them to resist. So as a result, even though chemical dependency is a disease and not a moral problem, to remain abstinent, the addict may need to behave in a manner that is, quote unquote, more moral than what is good enough for the rest of the world. Excessive guilt is going to pose a real danger if it is allowed to build. A well-considered code of ethics, both professional and personal, can really be a source of inner strength and confidence here. Chemical dependency counselors come from a variety of backgrounds, and they bring with them this wide array of credentials. Many are going to enter the field from social work, psychology, psychiatric nursing, or even medicine. Unfortunately, most of the professional schools, even the ones with the finest reputations, they can't be relied on to teach their graduates about chemical dependency, and sometimes what they do offer is inaccurate. This seems to stem from this basic failure to appreciate that there is a specialized body of knowledge professionals should sort of possess to work effectively in this field. And when a school does not acknowledge that this vital information exists, students are not aware that they should attempt to gain it. So a physician or a nurse would never dream of working in a coronary care unit without adequate schooling. Will often plunge into the business of giving advice or medications to an addicted person with hardly a second thought. Unfortunately, since these professionals are perceived as authorities by both the patient and the family, their mistakes can be hard to correct. The additional background that these professionals have does prove extremely useful once the other specialized material has been learned. And one of the reasons many people have earned certification as counselors and list the CAC or equivalent credential after the MD or the RN or the PhD or the MSW is to alert others to the fact that holding a degree other than certification in the addiction field says nothing about one's ability to do this specific work. The counselor who has earned certification in a specialized academic chemical dependency program or who lacks a degree might have quite a different problem. In the 1970s, when federal money became available for the chemical dependency training, and colleges and universities started rushing to develop these courses in alcoholism counseling, frequently at a master's degree level. These were often a combination of parts of pre-existing courses that were borrowed from other disciplines, plus some additional practical experience working in a chemical dependency agency. Because these were new and unfamiliar degrees, those hiring the graduates were unsure of how much or how little they were taught or what they were prepared to do. So while some of this material was excellent, a code of ethics was almost never addressed. Most colleges and states now require a course in ethics for addiction professionals, though. In a still more unsettled position is the counselor whose major qualification is personal recovery. As a wise manager of a woman's halfway house once said, just because you had your appendix out does not qualify you to take out mine. It may get you interested, but that's all. So just as a professional from another discipline must be schooled in chemical dependency counseling, so too a counselor with personal chemical dependency experience has a lot to learn. The former will be able to take advantage of previous training, while the latter will have the ability to function as a role model of successful recovery, as well as know how suffering from chemical dependency can feel. These are different strengths which can be used in a completely different fashion to help a patient, or which can lead to competition between the recovered and the non-recovered professional. You should note that when I say recovered, I'm following the wording of the Big Book of AA. Here, recovered does not mean cured, in the sense that chemically dependent people will never use alcohol or mood-altering drugs again. So for this reason, some prefer the term recovering to remind themselves that they must always avoid that first drink or other drug. However, AA guidelines warn members not to use the term recovering outside of the fellowship, lest it be misunderstood to mean that the person is still using. So, as National Council on Alcoholism, the founder, Marty Mann, said at a conference in Salt Lake City in 1976, recovering to an outsider means that AA doesn't work. That after 37 years, she had still not recovered, that she was still sick. Growth is a sign of health. Life is not static, so progress, rather than perfection, remains that goal that's recommended for alcoholics. Recovering is an appropriate term in early stages of remission where mere abstinence is not proof of genuine sobriety or stable recovery. I like to use patient and client interchangeably, and I'm aware that consistency demands that if chemical dependency is called a disease, then its victims are patients. In one regard, chemical dependency counselors are in the unique position of kind of belonging to this profession that's dedicated to treating just one specific type of illness. Physicians and nurses are expected to care for a variety of illnesses, but addiction counselors are in this strange position of being expected to understand how to treat addictive diseases, but not other things. Unfortunately, human problems refuse to stay neatly pigeonholed, so a host of other issues immediately arise. So if counselors deal only with the alcohol and the other drugs, they risk being called narrow or limited or rigid. And if they lean too far the other way, the outcry, though different, is just as loud. So the ability to serve as a role model is the one and only thing the successfully recovered person can offer that no one else can. If liked, accepted, and admired, this person can be believed and imitated, and can offer hope and reassurance that a life entirely free of chemical supports can be rich and fulfilling. Recovered people have credentials that include not only what they know, but where they've been and what changes that they've made. And these credentials are powerful, but they may present a two-edged sword. How is the quality of a good role model judged? What is the quality or quantity of sobriety or abstinence or of the family recovery to be required? AA guidelines for AA members employed in the alcoholism field suggest that AA members have 3 to 5 years of abstinence before working in the field. And it should be at least 3 years of continuous sobriety and abstinence from other mood-altering drugs to really be essential. And this field has been plagued with individuals who, after being abstinent for only a few weeks, will present themselves as qualified to advise others. Treatment agencies may be all too willing to hire and exploit those people too. Their salary demands are often low since they may not be employable elsewhere, and their good intentions are quite genuine, and their level of energy and dedication is really high. The would-be employer may be tempted to hire such a person in order to offer a safe environment, what can be called a form of extended treatment. But this involves a really tremendous risk. It's going to be hard to pass on to others what we have not yet learned for ourselves, and recovering people who cannot function except by working in the field of their own illness are extremely limited. And this is both in terms of personal recovery and in the quality of the counseling that they're able to offer. This may be denied, and many anecdotes may be served up to illustrate the virtues of leaping immediately from patient to therapist status, but a sheltered workshop for a person not yet entirely well is just that. If working with other chemically dependent people is the right career choice for someone, it's going to remain so after a period of consideration and training, and after some work experience and personal recovery in the outside world. It pays to consider carefully the real reasons for all the rush. It should be obvious that it's unethical to claim qualifications that we don't possess just because we're in the process of acquiring them. The human qualities that are needed to counsel addicts and their families are essentially the same as for counseling people with other problems. The appropriate knowledge base, the openness, the realistic empathy, the personal warmth, and a great deal of self-awareness. The very success of AA and other 12-step groups and the impressive performance of their members who have entered the counseling field has led to a great deal of respect for their efforts. Unfortunately, there's a lot of outsiders that are unable to distinguish between the mature and the competent recovered person with good quality sobriety and the persuasive, attractive con artist. Those who have had experience running treatment agencies will share war stories of staff that they've hired, ending their recital with a plea that for the sake of the patients and everybody else concerned, references be requested and meticulously checked before any prospective employee is authorized to treat other people. An attractive candidate who seems the least likely to need investigation may be the very person who needs it the most. And some of the people most impatient to start treating others and least likely to question their ability or qualifications are the people who have already been working as professionals in the healthcare field, and they are also newly recovered. Already accustomed to seeing themselves and being seen as experts, their new insights and personal knowledge seems to be all they need, and in they plunge. In a field often short of qualified professionals, they're frequently seen as a miraculous solution to a personal problem and are welcomed with open arms. Sometimes this works, but interest alone does not mean ability, nor does the experience of personal recovery. Counseling chemically dependent people involves skills and aptitudes that may or may not be there, regardless of their good intentions. So while a layperson is usually carefully screened and may be refused a position, no such constraints or lack of credentials may slow the newly recovered, an eager psychologist or a physician who is today's patient and decides to be tomorrow's expert. If we have had a family member with an alcohol or other drug problem, it's just as important to have dealt with that as thoroughly as if we'd faced such a problem ourselves. Recovered people can at least use a dry date as a partial measure of success, even if it came many months after treatment or regular attendance in a 12-step group. But how do we set a date, even that crude, as a measure for the spouse who may have had years of marital counseling and Al-Anon attendance before beginning to sense what either one was all about? We owe it to our patients and also to ourselves to kind of determine whether we're entering this field for the patient's well-being or to find our own personal answers. We might find our motives are mixed, and if so, that does not mean that we must avoid the field, but we had best be fully aware of the hazards and have skilled supervision in facing them. America is very conscious on laws and traditions regarding discrimination due to race, creed, national origin, color, age, gender, sexual orientation. And alcoholism and other drug addictions are disabilities that are protected from discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So one can't be denied employment or dismissed simply for being chemically dependent if otherwise they're properly qualified. But that doesn't mean that somebody can't be dismissed for poor job performance that results from their chemical dependency. And sometimes recovered people practice sort of a reverse discrimination on the basis of how bad the consequences of the drug use became. So we'll hear, he's got his sobriety between clean sheets. And that just means that the person doesn't deserve that same consideration as somebody who maybe slept under bridges. So this form of discrimination can be directed toward both recovered and non-recovered people. And sometimes it's high bottom versus low bottom, with what verges on anger that's directed at the person who comes seeking sobriety without having first suffered enough. So Tradition 8 says that Alcoholics Anonymous should remain forever non-professional. But this does not preclude individual members from becoming professionals. Some unwritten AA traditions suggest that members who are also professionals never be sponsors for any of their own patients or chair any AA meetings in the treatment facility where they're employed. This practice could easily confuse patients and maybe the distinct roles of treatment and AA. And then a particularly hard problem to face is that of counselors or other addiction professionals who relapse. And they do relapse. So as of that moment, the credential of successful role model is lost. The counselor may be supporting a family and have very few qualifications to do other kinds of work. Who's going to take over that caseload? Suppose the relapse is not into drinking or hard drug use, but more a subtle matter of using other seemingly less dangerous drugs. Isn't it inconsistent to advocate employee assistance programs, insisting that chemical dependency is a disease, only to immediately dismiss a professional who relapses? The employer knows that the illness is there and that a certain number of relapses are entirely possible, as is any chronic illness. And this is a point on which we have an obligation to educate the public as well as professionals, in this instance, by the example of our own behavior. So what are the patients going to be told? Will they be lied to after all that that we've said about openness and honesty? If we choose candor, is it fair to ask a patient to accept treatment from someone else, fresh from a relapse? We often advise others to stick with the winners. So can we ask patients to accept a group leader who has not been winning? And none of this is dealt with the fact that the person in relapse is very much like us, with all of our common humanity and vulnerability, yet we must decide, and it will rarely be easy. If an institution is large enough, the person in relapse can be offered another position that maybe doesn't necessarily involve patient contact. Like in a halfway house with 4 staff members, that option doesn't exist. But in a large treatment community where residents and staff progress by stages from new arrival to maybe staff status, maybe a demotion without separation is a possibility. And most facilities are going to have to make a more black or white go or stay decision. And since this problem is going to come up sooner or later, it should be discussed before it happens so that employees know what to expect and management knows what kind of action to take. So ideally, this policy should be made known to any new staff when they're hired so that decisions are not made in the heat of a crisis and staff's not quarreling amongst themselves over what should be done. So whatever policy that it is that gets adopted, it's going to have profound effect on the running of the institution and on staff and patient morale. And no matter what is decided, it's going to have a certain no-win element to it. And there's rarely going to be full agreement among all the parties when a relapse happens. So this distress can be held to a minimum if there has been some thoughtful planning beforehand. If an initial job requirement is at least 2 years of recovery and that's violated, reality is just going to dictate that the employee not be rehired until that time has passed. There's no way to speed the passage of time. In other professions, a license may be withheld for arbitrary and even ridiculously long periods. If an addiction counselor is to claim the benefits of being seen as a professional, some of those limitations have to be accepted as well. More difficult may be the problem presented by the person who doesn't have that previous history of chemical dependency, but who develops a dependency while working in the addiction field. There may be no conscious awareness that trouble was on the way, although there is the possibility that an awareness of one's own addictive tendencies may account for an interest in the field in the first place. So chemical dependency might not be contagious, but it often looks that way. Again, there's no easy answers, but staff should be clear about what is regarded as appropriate personal use of alcohol or other drugs, and what's going to be that consequence if the policy is disregarded. And if staff complain that private life is just that and not the concern of the employer or the colleague, it is, quite a reply, in particular in this field. The use of chemicals and one's belief system about them are job related. So if one is convinced that the answer to human problems is chemical use, it's hard to see how that conviction can be left at home. The time to settle these questions is before, not after the person is hired.